Welcome into the GigEm247 Sports Podcast. I am Andrew Hattersley, joined by Carter Carls, here to talk a little baseball and a little football on this edition of the podcast. A&M baseball's season came to an end on Monday night in disappointing fashion with a loss to Stanford. We're certainly going to dive into all of that, look ahead to the future, and on the football side, there was some schedule news last week. I know everybody loves talking schedule, and there's a lot to get to there. The SEC announced that they would be going with an 8-game schedule in 2024 for the conference play, and then reevaluate things where they stand in 2025 and beyond, with Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC. We're certainly going to look into that as well and talk that. But got to start on the baseball side. Carter, you've had a couple late nights. How have you been?
Ooh, still waking up. Yeah, it's those West Coast games. I don't know how people do it. I love watching Pac-12 after dark after a long day for college football, but man, so those late night baseball games can be brutal to cover. But it was fun, man. I love postseason sports. I love postseason college baseball. It was really a fun regional to cover, but yeah, pretty disappointing for A&M.
No doubt A&M wins the first two games of the regional over Cal State Fullerton, and Stanford looked to be in a pretty good spot. Stanford and Cal State Fullerton were playing in a elimination game earlier on Sunday. Stanford ends up rallying to win that game and then beats A&M 13-5. And at that point, you're sitting there thinking, okay, A&M still got one more game to go. Should have the advantage. Stanford will be playing for the third time in 2 days. Maybe some advantages to take advantage of there in terms of pitching, but not to be. A&M loses Monday night 7-1 as their season comes to an end. Stanford will advance on to the Super Regional to take on Texas, and I think there's a couple storylines, at least for me, in this regional. One of the big questions coming to the regional was could A&M kind of, had they turned the corner after the SEC tournament from a pitching standpoint? And the starters struggled. That's just the truth of the matter in the regional again. Guys that weren't able to make it out of the second inning, and you manage differently in the postseason. I think that's important to note as well. Is you don't have time to mess around and let a guy maybe figure it out in the third or fourth inning. So it is managed differently in the postseason, but nonetheless, guys still struggling to get through a couple innings. And they were able to at least withstand that the first two nights and get the bats going. But the bats went really quiet against Stanford, and that ended up costing them score just six runs over two nights against Stanford. And Nathan Detmer actually pitched pretty well last night and gave A&M what they were really looking for. He was able to work deeper into the game than maybe some were expecting. But Carter, it just didn't feel like they were able to get the timely hits when they needed to, and that Stanford lineup can do damage in a hurry, and we saw that over the last two nights.
Going in this regional, really A&M, at least like this regional final, it really seemed like they were going to be able to score a lot of runs when you just figure that, okay, Stanford's got some talent for sure in that pitching staff. I mean, we saw some of those guys that they were throwing, that they were not scrubs, but by the time they got to that regional final, they've played a few games, they're deep in the regional. They've got their lowest ERA or highest ERA, however you want to say it, 5.99 going into this regional that they've had in the season since 2009. Pitching definitely the weak point for this team. Their defense isn't all that great either. And so you figure, so you're playing a kind of middling pitching staff. You're playing a worn-out pitching staff, and their best pitcher, the Pac-12 pitcher of the year, Quinn Matthews, had thrown 114 pitches on Friday. So you're thinking, man, this is looking good. Even if they manage to win this first game, by the second game, they're going to be throwing, absolute scrubs out there. But that's not how it turned out for A&M. Really a kind of staggering look for them at the plate sometimes with, just some bad at bats and just a lot of pop ups. Just seemed like they could not get anything going with runners on base or runners in scoring position. It was a really tough weekend for Trevor Werner. It was a really tough weekend for a few other guys as well. But you look, I kind of crunched the numbers, and last 17 innings, they obviously did amazing that first inning against Stanford on Sunday. But the last 17, they were 4 of 32 with runners on base and 0 of 11 with runners in scoring position. So any opportunity they had to generate some runs, they couldn't do it. They got 2 runs in those 17 innings. And another weird thing, in that last game, Jace LaViolette was really the only guy who was, figuring it out from the plate. And all 4 of his at-bats came at the very beginning of the inning. So he never got an opportunity to hit with someone on base or someone in scoring position. It's just kind of bad luck sometimes with these things, but A&M just didn't put itself in a good position. I felt like they weren't aggressive on the base paths. I felt like they were pop-up city sometimes. So, and even just trying to work some counts, work some high counts and get these guys up in their pitch count. You felt like Matt Scott won a couple innings and Quinn Matthews was able to go like 4 innings. And, you look at it, Quinn Matthews, like, how is he going 4 innings? If you're A&M, you would have hoped that you got him out in 1 or 2 innings. And then they only had to throw Ryan Bruno 1 inning. And I felt like he didn't have that great of command, and he was throwing some balls, not really in command of the strike zone. And A&M just kind of let him get away with it by swinging at some of these bad balls. So, it's just a mess from the plate. A lot of inconsistency there all season. And you look at a lot of their guys in their lineup, and a lot of regression this year. Austin Bose, Brett Minnick, Ryan Targach. There's been a lot of, he hit 330 this year and he's hitting 240 this year. So it was a really kind of a surprising result, considering where this team went into the season feeling, coming off the College World Series, being preseason ranked number 5. And yes, they had a really nice run here to end the season. They won 6 of the last 8 SEC series. They went all the way to the SEC tournament, and they went into this regional final in 2 games. But considering where the expectations were preseason and considering the guys that they brought back, it's a disappointment to me because, man, it should have been much better than this. We should have been talking about another College World Series appearance, or at least a super regional appearance, and now they don't have either.
No doubt. And, it is a disappointment because there was a lot of talent on this roster, but you mentioned it. They were just never able to really get things firing this year when, they got the pitching going at times. It was the bats that struggled, and then vice versa. And that kind of, this weekend kind of felt like a, microcosm of the season where guys, they just weren't clicking at all cylinders at all times enough. Obviously that SEC tournament run was really, really good, but they just weren't clicking enough. And, I think one of the things, to your point, when you look at at least these 2 regional final games against Stanford, you talk about the pressure that they like to put on teams in the base pass. They had a chance to really put some pressure on Stanford if they could get out in front and get an early lead in either of these 2 games, because then you kind of start to force the hand of Stanford. You can do some things on the bases. It's exactly what Jim Schlossnagle talked about when they were in Hoover, that you can start to put pressure on the base paths. You can start to steal some bases, but when you're behind, you don't really have that margin for error and those outs. And so, everything just kind of tightens up. And I think that's part of what happened in the Stanford regional when in these last 2 games against Stanford. I think the big question now is, where are things going to go from here? There's going to be, obviously, I think, a lot of change in the offseason. There's guys that, have the opportunity to now head off to the MLB draft, guys who maybe have some decisions to make. And, it's hard to really project what a lineup's going to look like. You've got some guys that you can certainly build off of. Jace Laviolette is right at the top of the list. Obviously, Shane Sadeo out of the bullpen and what he was able to do is a really encouraging piece moving forward. Justin Lampkin, Troy Wongsing, some of these guys you have some nice pieces. Obviously, at Caden Kent, you've got him as a young player. Max Coffer, you've got him. What when you're Jim Schlossnagle on this staff right now, for me, the biggest priority this offseason is they have to go out and land some reinforcements on the pitching side. They have to go find guys that can step into the starting rotation and be a dominating Friday night starter and set the weekend up that way, because A&M's just had too much. For me, they've just had too much inconsistency the last 2 years when it comes to the pitching staff. And I think that's got to be the priority this offseason.
Yeah, I felt like so many games this year, they're behind 4-0, third inning, 6-2, fourth inning. That their starting pitching was terrible. Like a lot of people are like, oh, well, this guy, it was terrible all year. Really. I mean, they were lucky to even make the NCAA tournament with how bad their starting pitching was. And they were lucky to make the Stanford regional final. That's what I'm trying to say is, like, this run they had at the end of the season actually was pretty impressive when you consider how many 11-9 wins and bad starting pitching performances they got. I mean, Nathan Detmer last night, lasting 6 innings, I don't think he had done that since like March 17th against LSU. And this is their Friday starter. This was their number one guy. And Troy Wansing had been kind of a mess all year with the strike zone and kind of flipping back and forth on okay, now he's Sunday, now he's a reliever, now he's Saturday again. Justin Lampkin, same thing. Chris Cortez was the Sunday starter to start the season, and they barely even used him in this regional. So I think really the biggest glaring issue with this pitching staff is the right-handed pitchers. They just didn't have any options out of the bullpen, really. And so, a lot of your guys that you're bringing out there were lefties, and I felt like you had some guys you could really trust and build around with Johnston and Sadeo and Aschenbeck. But from a right-handed perspective, there wasn't really anybody that you could trust. So that's where I think they got a hammer in the portal. You're also losing at least a few pretty impactful guys offensively. You got Brett Minnick, he's expiring his eligibility. Jordan Thompson's expiring his eligibility. And Austin Boast, 12th man, expiring his eligibility. So that's at least 3 guys you're replacing. And then you got a lot of guys who could go pro, right? You're talking about Hunter Haas, Jack Moss, Trevor Werner, Nathan Detmer. There is a group in there that could leave, and they might be in a position where they're having to replace their whole infield. So I think this team next season, they've already added a few transfer commitments, but you're going to look at almost a completely different team next year. And that's why these next few weeks are going to be critical for Jim Schlossnagle as far as, okay, you had a hiccup this year, and I think it's fine. Like, it wasn't that, like, it was bad for sure, but it wasn't like, oh my gosh, where's this program going? Like, I still think you have a lot of confidence in what he's able to do. His track record speaks for himself, and really, I have no concern about where this program can be, and the fact that this is somebody that can consistently take them to a College World Series. On the other hand, I say, wow, they're losing a lot of guys next year potentially. They're losing a lot of key contributors, and they're going to have to completely flip the roster most likely. And so that's why these next few weeks could really determine the outlook of next season. And we're talking about almost a completely different team. And could be a bit of a rebuild. I don't know, but if they do a really good job in over this offseason, then who knows? Maybe they can get past that regional this next year.
No doubt, a lot of questions, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Ryan Praker, obviously, as a guy that,
Yeah.
it was a blow to lose him, and a guy you're going to hopefully be able to get back next year, work him into the fold, and potentially he's somebody that can factor into the rotation potentially, or at least in the bullpen, and be a really impactful guy. And so another lefty, like you said, so they've got to start developing, whether it's internally or via the transfer portal, have got to develop some of those right-handed pitchers, because you're right, they just really didn't have anybody reliable to turn to, whether it was out of the bullpen or in the starting rotation, or just enough of it. So they've really got to address that part of it. And you're right, there's going to be some decisions, but there were some decisions last year, and some of these guys chose to come back for another year. Trevor Warner was one good example of a guy that chose to come back for another year, and we'll see what Hunter Haas and Jack Moss opt to do as well. But certainly going to be another eventful offseason with a lot of moving and a lot of moving pieces, and we will certainly keep you guys up to date on everything related to Texas A&M baseball on the site. So be sure to stay tuned to GigEm247 for the latest there. We're going to switch gears and talk a little football after the break. As I mentioned, the SEC schedule will get announced next week. They did reveal at the end of the SEC spring meetings that they were opting to go to an 8-game schedule. Carter has a lot to say about that, so we're going to get his take right after a quick break. Welcome back into the GigEm247 Sports Podcast. I am Andrew Hattersley, joined by Carter Carls. We're going to talk a little football. The SEC making news, obviously, last week at the end of their meetings. It kind of felt like it was kind of a yo-yo going back and forth over the course of the week. Things kind of entered with maybe a 9-game schedule on the table. Then, some questions about whether they were going to stay at 8, whether they would even make a decision. And then it comes to the point of the 8-game schedule in 2024 for conference play, when Texas and Oklahoma join in the conference. Carter, what do you make of all this, and then opting to go with an 8-game schedule, at least for 1 year?
Well, it just speaks to where this conference is at, as far as there's a lot of people at the table that have differing opinions, and there's a lot of politics involved. And it's not surprising. That's how these things go. That's why when anybody reports like, oh yeah, A&M 9-game schedule, Miss State, LSU, Texas, finalized, done deal. I'm like, no, it's not.
It's not done until it's signed.
There was so much of that. I mean, like literally everybody was like, oh yeah, it's done deal, 100%, Miss State, get ready. And I'm like, no, it's not done. Like, do you understand that there's 14 of these teams about to be 16, and they all whine and complain and argue constantly? Alabama coach Nick Saban has been saying, oh, 9 games. And then all of a sudden he's like, ooh, but Tennessee and Auburn and LSU, like, that seems pretty hard. I don't like that. And it's like, you're not going to satisfy all these people. There are going to be people that get screwed. There are going to be people that don't get their way. And that's just life. And so what's funny to me is it seems like they're kind of delaying the inevitable. They kind of have this 1 year where they can have a mulligan and say, all right, we're going to spend more time on this, because, this coming year, you can preserve all your rivalries with the 8-game schedule for 2024. You can preserve all the rivalries, but you can't do that again in 2025, because you just be doing the same schedule. So you have this 1 year mulligan. Like, it's not the end of the world, but what I want to know is what's going to change between now and decision time that's going to change your thinking. Like nothing about Like they say it could be within this next year. Well, there's not going to be a 12-team playoff in the 2023, so it's not like you're going to receive any more information. There's not going to be any more data out there that can make you come to this decision. So I feel like we're just going to reboot the arguments once again, and it's going to be the same political game. But ultimately, what I'd say is, the 8-game schedule, 9-game schedule, there's a lot of talk about preserving rivalries and, hey, we want the lesser teams to make a bowl game, and oh, well, we want it this way to help us get in the playoff. For me, I love the rivalries. I'd love to see A&M play Texas every year. But I feel like the name of the game, like there's two things I don't really care about. It's one, let's keep it 8 games so Vanderbilt can make a bowl game. I don't care about that. I think that's a weak argument. It's like the difference between 5 and 6 games. Like, sorry, man. Like that's not a driving force behind this. Number two, the whole, we might get $10 million more a year or whatever from ESPN if we do 9 games. Who cares? Like, you've already got if you're A&M, you've already got all the facilities, you already got all the NIL money. What's an extra $10 million going to do for you? Like, you already got all the money you could ever spend with this new deal and what you already have. So that, to me, that doesn't matter. Preserving rivalries is a great argument for sure. But yeah. I think A&M fans, and maybe this is a hot take, but I feel like you would care a lot more about making the playoff than you would playing Texas every year. If you had to choose between the two, would you rather compete for championships or preserve this rivalry you've got? And that's the question is, will an 8-team or a 9-team help you make the playoff more? That's the biggest question to me. That's what everyone should be talking about. I don't, as much as I care about the rivalries, to me, that's secondary. That doesn't matter as much about, will this help me make the playoff? And for me, you'd like to think that 9 games will help you make the playoff more if you're one of the elite teams in the conference, because you'd say, well, we'd have to shrink the schedule. We could have like an RPI system that we've got in basketball and baseball where, even if we go 9-3, I mean, we play Georgia and LSU and Bama and OU and Texas. So of course we deserve to be in. But I keep, the cynic in me keeps saying, is that really going to get you in? Because you'd basically be saying under a 9-game schedule, you only do that if they let 6 teams in from the SEC every year, like 5 or 6, because otherwise it's going to be 3 or 4 and any 9-3 team is not going to be in. And so for me, I'm like, if you go to 9 games, you better freaking get 5 or 6 teams in, or 4 or 5, because otherwise it's a waste of time. You're just you're increasing your chance of losing another game as compared to just scheduling New Mexico. So I know it sounds like a scaredy cat, cowardly thing, but to me, that's how you have to look at this. Does it help me get in the playoff or not? And we don't know yet how the committee will look at this. And I'm just saying we can't just assume that extra game is going to mean everything to them when you have all these other conferences, and A&M at 9-3 may not be as compelling to them as Baylor at 11-1 or Clemson at 10-2. So I know I'm rambling. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but to me, I'm like, if we're ranking the order of importance, the playoff is number 1, the rivalries is number 2, and then the way down here is like the bowl game stuff and the money, because that doesn't affect me as a fan or as a reporter or as a whatever. Like, that does not affect anybody that is watching this stuff. But these two things, the rivalry and the playoff, matter more. And if I had to rank, hey, play Texas every year or make the playoff, the playoff matters more to me if you're a fan. But anyway, I'm rambling, but I'm going to throw it back at you, see what you think. But the 8 or 9 thing, I'm telling you, it's so many people are split on this. I don't fault people for thinking opposite of me, because there's so many directions this thing could go.
Yeah, there's such a debate about it. And I agree with you when you consider the fact that, you know, five of those spots are going to go to conference champions. Now suddenly you're just down to basically 6, 7 spots that you're trying to basically argue A&M or the SEC should get four of those spots, and that's going to be a lot to ask. If you go to a 9 game schedule, you're right. If how, you're going to have the committee basically weighing a 9-3 SEC team against an 11-1, potentially 10-2 um, team for another conference, and that's you're not always gonna win that battle, and so you are taking a risk. I do wonder if this extra year, because you're right. And when you listen to them talk, you know, ESPN, are they gonna how much are they gonna pay for that extra game? How much can they pay for that extra game? There's the reality going on right now that there's quite a few layoffs going on around ESPN right now, and
Yeah.
what are they going to pay for that extra game? Is it going to be worth potentially adding a game and uh, you know what's that going to do for your college football playoff chances? So I think that is a real concern. I think the rivalries, like you said, it's I don't think everyone's going to get their perfect system, and I think that everybody's got to kind of understand that. And I think you've got A&M in one quarter. I think when you listen to Ross Bjork talk and you listen to Jimbo Fisher talk, I think one of the reasons they've talked about 9 games is for the reason, like you mentioned, that they would get to play LSU every year. That's a game that has developed into a pretty good rivalry. There's been some pretty good games there. When you talk about the 7 overtime game, you talk about uh, just some of the battles that they've had on the recruiting trail and everything going on there. I think that's turned into a pretty good game at the end of the year, and I think it's worked well for A&M and it's worked well for LSU. And then you start getting to the argument, well, is it LSU or is it A&M or is it Texas who's the permanent rival? Who does Texas want? Well, Texas and OU have their
Yeah.
game every year, and what are they going to give up? And so you start getting into that, and I think that was kind of A&M's reasoning: is one, play 9 games, two, you play 9 games and you have 3 permanent rivals. That allows you to get everybody that you kind of need to get in, and that gets you LSU, that gets you Texas, and I think A&M is completely fine with whoever that third game is, whether it's Mississippi State, whether it was Arkansas, whoever it is. I think there's an understanding that at least you're going to be able to play everybody 2 years, every 2 years, and considering the fact that Georgia's never been to Kyle Field. I mean, that's still just a crazy uh, thing to think about. Since
And
A&M joined the SEC, I mean, it's just crazy to think about. And I do wonder if one of the conversations over the next year is going to be potentially. There's been so much focus on a 7-1 model and a 6-3 model. If they do want to stick at 8 games, I do wonder if they're going to go back to the drawing board over this next year and kind of put minds together and say, is there something we can do with maybe a 6-2 model? Can we potentially meet everybody in the middle and give you two permanent rivals and, rotate the other 6 or some sort of model like that if you do want to stick at 8 games? I'm intrigued to see if that kind of starts to surface a little more, if that's kind of the middle point that a lot of athletic directors get to appease some of the folks who may want to stick at 8 games. I'm with you. I don't think the bowl game conversation should be as big a focus. I know, for Vanderbilt, sorry, like you're going to lose
yeah.
that argument. This is more about protecting rivalries. This is more about positioning for the college football playoff.
Vanderbilt can go to the
And
Sun Belt if they want to. If they want to make a bowl.
exactly. And you know what? When you hear Clark Lee talk, he was kind of talking about it last week at SEC spring meetings. He said, he's kind of getting annoyed with everybody who's kind of congratulating them on having, this step forward year, and they didn't even make a bowl last year. He kind of
Mhm.
said, I get where people are coming from, but that's annoying as well at the same front. So, I think they're trying to take the step forward as well, and good for
Yeah.
them for doing that. But that the bowl game conversation to me, if you're sitting at 6-6, you're probably not a great team anyway. So
Yeah.
uh, you're just very average. And that's this conversation is about how do you position yourself as well as you possibly can to make the college football playoff. Money is going to be involved in everything. That's just a reality. And what ESPN can pay for the ninth game is going to be involved as well. That's just a factor of this that they have to navigate. I don't think they're going to learn a whole lot more in the next year about whether an 8 or 9 game schedule is more beneficial. I just don't. I'm with you. They're not going to have the data points to be able to do that. And so, the question is, do you kick it another? You can't really kick it another year down the road. You could potentially have a plan to say, okay, we'll do 8 games for these 2 years and then move to a 9 game schedule down the road. But I guess you could do that. But I'm with you. I just don't think you're going to have enough data. So the college football playoff conversation is going to be one you might have to make without any verified data, and you're
Yeah.
going to have to project a little bit, and that's just the way that goes. And um, I agree. They do need to come to some sort of agreement, though, and it does feel like it kind of needs to happen in the next 12 months.
And what I'll say, like I love how forthright like Buzz Williams is about the whole tournament selection process, because he said multiple times, like, he's so frustrated by it. He's like, I just want to know what the criteria is. I want to know. I wish there was some meeting in June where some random dude in a jacket starts talking about, hey, this is what we look at. There's not anything like that for football. And so when people speak with so much confidence, oh, 9 games, 100% will help you make the playoff more. You don't know that. I don't know that. We don't know if 8 games helps more. We don't know. And so I've been a little surprised hearing Ross Bjork talk about it, because he has constantly been like, oh, yeah, it'll help. It'll help. And I'm like, but how do you know this? And I just think back to 2020, and I almost tell A&M fans, do you remember 3 years ago? Do you remember how one little loss to Alabama? It wasn't a little loss; it was a big loss. But
It's a big
one
loss.
loss to Alabama. Do we remember the conversation was, well, they had their opportunity and they sucked. They lost. They lost that game. They suck. They don't deserve it. And it was like, dude, but they beat every other SEC team by double digits, and they played at Bama, and it was actually a tie game in the second quarter, but Kellen Mond threw a pick six, and it kind of snowballed. So it
Game
wasn't
kind of went out from there.
– you watch the game, like, they competed better with them than a lot of other teams did, and then you're like, okay, well, Notre Dame just got destroyed by Clemson like 1 day before the selection show. But all the talk was, well, they suck. They lost that one game. And, oh, that one night they played LSU when it was monsooning. They only beat them by 20. And, oh, they only beat this team by 26. And it was like, what in the world? So I just imagine a world where here we are in 2026 and A&M's 9-3, and their 3 losses are to Georgia, LSU, and Bama. And they've got a couple decent wins, but nothing crazy. And then the conversation becomes, oh, well, they had their chance. They could have beaten 3 of the top 5 teams in the country, but they didn't, so they suck. And Baylor is 11-1. They actually won their games, so they deserve to make it. That I totally see that happening. I know it's going to happen. That's just my thought on the issue, because we've seen this happen before, where you don't win against that big opponent and it's just used against you. And because a team hasn't played that big opponent, like a Baylor or a Clemson, they're kind of given this benefit of the doubt of like, well, they won their games that mattered and you didn't, instead of more of the strength of schedule and eye test kind of considered. So I caution people. I know 9 games sounds great. You preserve the rivalries. It strengthens your schedule. But do we really think that one extra game is going to tell these committee members, oh, well, this 9-3 team deserves to be in. And you know what? We're going to have 5 SEC teams in the playoff. I just don't see it shaping out that way. Again, I'm more than willing to be proven wrong on that, and can see a way where it does get considered more than I'm thinking it will. But as it stands, what we've seen in the past they don't give a lot of grace for those kind of losses. And yeah, we'll see. I'm just saying, don't assume. Like, we don't know yet,
Well,
and so
then
don't assume.
the other question too, there's so many questions and like dynamics to this, because when you consider, okay, if you stay at 8 games, you're still probably going to get a ninth really good game, because you're going to have a Power Five opponent in the non-conference portion of your schedule. Whether that's Miami, Notre Dame, Louisville, whoever that is. Um, that's going to be another opportunity to kind of add another resume point. And so, if you go to a 9-game schedule, okay, well, do you still continue to play a Power Five opponent in the non-conference? Because then you're playing 10 Power Five games, and then so you're adding potentially another Power Five game there. For the fans, I think they would love it. I think fans would enjoy it, because you get to see
Yeah,
there's a ton of really good matchups. I can see from a fan standpoint
you
the
would love
appeal
it,
of going
but
to
not if
10
you're going
games.
to
It would
the
be
playoffs.
it'd be a ton of fun. It would
Yeah,
be a it would be a really, really, really difficult schedule. And so I think the other point to kind of keep in mind, and I think this is another thing that hasn't been mentioned quite as much when it comes to A&M. It's going to be a problem for Texas and Oklahoma when they enter the SEC. If you do stay at 8 games, is home games and playing a neutral site game. If you have an A&M, obviously Ross Bjork has made it perfectly clear at this point that from A&M's perspective, they do not intend to continue the Arkansas game at AT&T Stadium once the agreement is up. That's, to me, that becomes a bigger deal now, because you're going to be able to get that game back on campus. And if you're Texas and Oklahoma, you heard Chris Del Conte mention it during his time in Destin, that's going to really end up hurting Texas and Oklahoma if you stick at 8 games, and they're basically going to be losing. There could be some years where they're playing 3 conference home games, or there could be that with playing the neutral site game against Oklahoma. So I think that could end up working out in A&M's favor with the game against Arkansas, going you know, uh, back to each respective team's stadium. So a lot to unpack, and this is a conversation. We went 20 plus minutes going back and forth on this. Ads are going to be going back and forth on this for hours over the next couple of months, trying to figure it all out. There's going to be, like you said, there's going to be a lot of opinions in the room, and I think your point was exactly right. Anybody who comes out and definitively says, "I know this is happening and this is who A&M's permanent opponents are going to be," you don't, because things can always change. We saw how quickly things kind of shifted and went back and forth over the last couple of weeks between the 9 and 8 schedule. Who was the permanent opponents? How are things going to work out? And um, so yeah, just it's going to be fun to watch, but just have a little patience that they're going to get it worked out. But read everything with a little bit of skepticism, and question, does this really make sense, or is this really logical as for when it's coming out right now? So until then, we're both you and I are heading over to the camps over at College Station, which will be taking place Wednesday through Friday. We'll have you covered with all the coverage over on GigEm247, and be sure to stay locked in there. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the 60% flash sale that is going on right now for a huge month of June, as A&M welcomes a ton of official visitors to campus. A great deal to take advantage of there. And otherwise, we'll be back next week to discuss plenty more about the visitors A&M's had on campus, how things are looking on the recruiting front, and talk more about the team side as well. So have a good week, everybody, and we'll see you guys soon.